There was always an empty kind of space around Frank Fritz, even when he was sitting right there. Not absence, something gentler. A pause. On long Midwest highways, when the van hummed and barns blurred into cornfields, Frank didn't rush to fill silence. He let it breathe. That was his gift, long before television ever found him. He understood that stories don't reveal themselves to people who chase them. They come to those who wait. In a world that celebrates volume, Frank was a listener. And when the cameras later captured him, viewers sensed something rare. This was not a man acting curious. He was genuinely moved by the weight of forgotten objects, by the fingerprints of people who once loved them. But the version of Frank that millions came to know was incomplete. Not wrong, just unfinished. Because behind the steady eyes and soft grin was a man constantly negotiating with pain, disappointment, and a quiet fear that usefulness, once lost, might never return. Frank's life was never a straight road. It was a series of detours, some chosen, many not. And the further he traveled from the early days, the heavier those turns became. This story isn't about a television personality fading from view. It's about a human being whose greatest strength, his stillness, made it easier for the world to move on without noticing how much he was hurting. Long before fame, Frank Fritz lived in a rhythm most people never master, curiosity without urgency. He didn't grow up dreaming of television or applause. He grew up surrounded by remnants, rusted tools, toy tractors, advertising tins that whispered about lives lived before his own. To Frank, these weren't collectibles. They were proof that ordinary people mattered. He had an instinctive respect for the past, not as nostalgia, but as responsibility. When he picked something up, he imagined the hands that once depended on it. That instinct shaped the way he moved through the world. When American Pickers began, it wasn't a show yet. It was two friends chasing roadside leads, sleeping in cheap motels, and trusting that the next door might open to something honest. Frank never tried to control the moment. He believed the best discoveries came when people felt safe enough to talk. While others negotiated with sharp edges, Frank softened rooms. Sellers opened up around him. They told stories they didn't plan to share. He remembered names, details, family histories. This wasn't strategy, it was empathy. And empathy, while powerful, extracts a cost. The more Frank absorbed other people's memories, the more he carried. Over time, that weight became invisible to viewers but unmistakable to those who knew him well. Even in the beginning, there was a quiet fatigue in him, not boredom, not regret. Just the sense of someone who felt everything deeply and rarely let it show. When American Pickers took off, Frank found himself living a life that moved faster than his body ever wanted to. Success arrived without ceremony, sudden schedules, constant travel, pressure to always be on. For someone like Frank, who thrived on stillness and reflection, the shift was jarring. Yet he adapted because loyalty mattered to him. He believed in the partnership, believed that shared history created shared responsibility. On camera, he remained steady. Off camera, the pace gnawed him. Crohn's disease had already shaped his adult life long before viewers ever noticed him. It wasn't dramatic, it was relentless. Pain that flared without warning, exhaustion that no amount of rest could reliably fix. Frank learned to work through it quietly because stopping felt like letting people down. The irony is cruel. The very thing audiences admired, his calm, his reliability, made it harder for anyone to see when he was nearing his limit. He didn't complain. He didn't dramatize, he just endured. As seasons passed, the show grew louder, faster, more polished. Frank stayed the same, and slowly, subtly, sameness in a changing environment begins to look like stagnation. He felt it. He sensed the center of gravity shifting, but he trusted time. Trusted that history, the thing he had always respected, would protect what they had built together. Pain has a way of disguising itself as inconvenience until the day it refuses to be ignored. For Frank, that day came when doctors delivered news that stripped away denial. His spine was failing him in a way that couldn't be postponed or negotiated. Surgery wasn't optional. It was survival. The procedure was brutal, rods, stitches, weeks of immobility, and it forced Frank into a kind of stillness he had never experienced. For the first time in decades, he wasn't moving forward. He wasn't driving, negotiating, filming. He was waiting. Recovery gave him too much time to think about how quickly routines disappear, about how identity gets tangled with productivity. He believed at first that stepping away was temporary. Heal, return, continue. That's how life had always worked for him. But healing is not a straight line, and neither is loyalty in an industry that moves on instinct. As weeks passed without calls, without updates, something heavier than physical pain settled in. Silence. It wasn't just professional, it was personal. Frank didn't need grand gestures. He needed reassurance that he still mattered, that the road hadn't closed behind him. And when that reassurance didn't come, doubt crept in. Doubt about friendships he thought were unbreakable. Doubt about whether empathy, the thing he'd given so freely, had ever been truly reciprocated. Recovery isolated Frank in ways fame never could. Away from the familiar chaos of filming, he confronted himself without distraction. Crohn's disease continued its unpredictable cycle, complicating healing and draining energy. Every small improvement felt earned through pain. Around the same time, Frank made another hard choice: sobriety. It wasn't a public performance or redemption arc. It was private, born from watching what alcohol had taken from people he loved. He wanted clarity. He wanted control over at least one thing in a body that felt increasingly unreliable. Nearly a year into sobriety, Frank believed he was rebuilding something solid. But rebuilding requires support, and support felt scarce. The absence of communication from the show and from people he once considered family created a quiet grief. Not anger, grief. He felt erased, not replaced, as if his contribution had already been archived and shelved. That kind of loss doesn't announce itself. It settles slowly, convincing you that maybe you were always less essential than you thought. Frank began to withdraw, not because he stopped caring, but because caring hurt too much when it wasn't returned. The road he loved had become a memory, and memories, no matter how cherished, can't carry you forward on their own. What wounded Frank most wasn't the loss of a job or the end of a show chapter. It was the fracture of friendship without explanation. He had believed that shared beginnings meant shared endings, but time revealed a different truth. Nearly 2 years passed without real conversation between Frank and Mike Wolfe. For someone who valued loyalty above almost everything, that silence felt like rejection. Frank spoke about it rarely, and when he did, there was no bitterness in his voice, only confusion. He understood that people grow apart. What he couldn't understand was how easily it seemed to happen. He had accepted being in the background. He had never needed the spotlight. What he needed was acknowledgement. A call. A check-in. Something to confirm that the bond he believed in wasn't imagined. Public statements came later, carefully worded and outwardly kind. Frank didn't find comfort in them. They felt performative, disconnected from the private reality he had lived. Two truths existed side by side, neither fully visible to outsiders. Fans debated, speculated, chose sides. Frank didn't engage. He was already carrying enough. The show continued, but to him it felt hollow. Not because it existed without him, but because it no longer resembled the thing he had helped create, a space built on shared curiosity, not hierarchy. In the summer of 2022, Frank's life narrowed to a single moment. A stroke, sudden, devastating, robbed him of control over his own body. When he woke, the right side of him no longer responded the way it once had. Independence, something he had quietly cherished, slipped away almost overnight. Doctors spoke carefully. Prognoses were uncertain. Recovery would be long, incomplete. The stroke was the result of years of strain, of systems pushed beyond their limits. Frank faced this new reality with the same quiet resolve he had always shown. But resolve doesn't restore mobility. It doesn't rebuild neural pathways. It only helps you endure. He could no longer live alone. Everyday tasks required assistance. The antique shop he loved, once an extension of his identity, began to decline without his presence. Objects remained, but the spirit was gone. Conservatorship became necessary, a practical solution that carried emotional weight. Frank, who had spent his life rescuing forgotten things, now depended on others to manage his own. It was a cruel symmetry. Still, when he could, he stayed involved, pricing items, making decisions, holding on to whatever fragments of agency remained. It mattered more than people realized. When news of Frank's condition became public, fans responded with shock and grief. Many hadn't realized how fragile he had become. Messages poured in: memories, gratitude, apologies for not noticing sooner. Frank appreciated them, but they also highlighted a painful truth. Care often arrives after damage is done. Amid the concern, old conflicts briefly faded. Mike Wolfe asked for prayers, urging people to focus on Frank's survival rather than past disagreements. For a moment, narratives softened. The situation transcended television. It became about a man fighting to stay alive. Frank's days were now structured around therapy sessions, medical appointments, and rest. Progress was measured in inches, not miles. Some days brought small victories. Others brought reminders of permanence. He adapted, but adaptation isn't the same as acceptance. He missed movement, missed the road, missed feeling useful without effort. Yet even in limitation, Frank remained thoughtful. He asked about others. He remembered details. His empathy didn't fade with his strength. If anything, it sharpened. He understood vulnerability now in a way few do. As time passed, Frank's health complications multiplied. Heart issues restricted circulation. COPD made breathing laborious. Each condition alone would have been manageable. Together, they exhausted him. Eventually, treatment shifted toward comfort. Hospice care wasn't an admission of defeat, it was an acknowledgement of reality. Frank's world became smaller, quieter. Visitors came when they could. Conversations lingered on memories rather than plans. Despite everything, Frank retained his sense of self. He wasn't defined by machines or diagnoses. He was still the man who noticed details, who listened carefully, who valued authenticity over spectacle. In 2023, something unexpected happened. After years of silence, Frank and Mike reunited. It wasn't for cameras. It wasn't a performance. Frank had asked to see him. When they met, emotions surfaced without restraint. There were tears, shared memories, unspoken regrets. Mike told Frank what he had long needed to hear, that he was irreplaceable. The words didn't undo the past, but they offered peace. Sometimes closure doesn't come in time to change outcomes. Sometimes it arrives simply to ease the ending. Frank's final months were defined by endurance, not recovery. The damage from his stroke continued to progress. Breathing grew harder. Strength faded, yet he was not alone. When Frank passed away on September 30th at the age of 60, the man who had once traveled thousands of miles in search of forgotten stories completed his own quiet journey. Mike Wolfe was there at the end, a presence that mattered. The goodbye was private, far removed from highways and barns. The next day, the world learned what had been lost. Tributes described Frank as the heart of American pickers, not because he commanded attention, but because he grounded it. He reminded viewers that objects gain value through human connection. The show continues, but something essential is gone. Frank Fritz didn't leave behind a perfect legacy. He left behind a truthful one. A life marked by curiosity, empathy, endurance, and unresolved pain. He wasn't always appreciated in real time. But in reflection, his absence speaks louder than his presence ever needed to. And maybe that is the final lesson Frank offers, that quiet people shape the world in ways we often only recognize once the silence becomes permanent.